My name is Fiona Slater, and I was 34 years old on the night my fiancé's family tried to buy my silence for the price of my own name. It happened at the rehearsal dinner, one night before my wedding, in a country club dining room glowing with candlelight and 60 guests who thought they were about to watch a woman get put in her place. My future mother-in-law stood, tapped her glass, and in front of every single one of them, slid a folded document across the white tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of me. Then, loud enough for the back tables to hear, loud enough that not one person in that room could pretend they hadn't heard it, she told me to sign it. Because I was a gold digger. Because I brought nothing to this family. I read every line. I picked up the pen. And 60 pairs of eyes leaned in at once, certain, absolutely certain, that they already knew how the story ended. They thought the folder sitting in front of me was empty. What I did next, with that pen already resting in my hand, and the reason my father-in-law nearly rose straight out of his chair at the far end of the table, is the part none of them ever saw coming. Not one of them. And by the time I'm done telling you this, you'll understand exactly why. Welcome back. If you're the kind of person who has ever been underestimated by people who owed you everything, you're among friends here tonight. Stay with me, because to understand that pen, and that folder, and that room full of stunned, silent faces, you have to go all the way back to a truck with a dented tailgate, a pair of cracked leather gloves, and every single thing I taught myself to hide. I own a company called Slater Grounds. Commercial landscaping and snow removal, the kind of work nobody ever puts on a magazine cover, the kind of work that only gets noticed when it doesn't get done. 12 years ago, it was one second-hand truck, a mower that barely started on cold mornings, and me answering the business line from a parking lot with numb fingers. Today, it's 40 trucks, 90 employees, and contracts running across 3 counties. Hospitals. Corporate campuses. The long gray stretch of interstate medians that nobody thinks about until the snow makes them impossible. The state pays my company to keep the roads clear. When it's 2 in the morning and the snow is falling sideways, my crews are the reason this county still gets to work in the morning. That business made me a wealthy woman. You would never guess it to look at me. I drive a 2009 pickup with a dent in the tailgate I've never bothered to fix. I wear the same soft, faded flannel shirts I wore back when I was 22 and had nothing. My hands are still rough because I still climb out of the truck and pull weeds myself when a job runs long. Money, for me, was never something you flaunted. It was something you built quietly and then guarded even more quietly. I learned that lesson young, and I learned it the hard way. Because every single time someone in my life discovered what I actually had, something shifted behind their eyes. The math would start. And then, not long after, the asking would follow. Friendships turned into proposals. A boyfriend once told me, with a straight face, that I made him feel small, and then he spent the rest of that relationship making absolutely sure I felt smaller. So I got good at disappearing in plain sight. I paid for things without flinching, and I let everyone around me assume the flinch was there anyway. I told myself it was humility. It wasn't. It was armor, forged in the coldest years of my life, because I had learned the hard, humiliating way that the fastest way to lose the people you love is to let them see exactly how much you're worth. For most of my life, that armor did precisely what I built it to do. Then I met a man who never once asked me what I earned. And that is where this story actually begins. The armor started with my grandmother. She raised me after my parents simply stopped being able to. She cleaned other people's houses for 30 years, and not once, not for a single second, did she carry herself like that made her less than the people whose marble floors she scrubbed on her knees. She had a pair of leather work gloves cracked, softened, molded by years of use, that she wore for everything. The garden. The gutters. The old lawnmower she nursed back to life season after season, long after any sensible person would have thrown it away. When I was a little girl, complaining that we didn't have what the other families on our street had, She would hold those gloves up to the light and tell me something I didn't understand until years later. Worth isn't inherited, she'd say. It's built. You make it with ease. She'd tap the leather, and nobody, ever, gets to take it back across the table from you. She died when I was 19. She left me almost nothing that a bank could ever count. She left me the gloves. I started my company 3 years after her funeral, with those same gloves tucked into the glove box of my very first truck, and I have carried them with me to every important day of my life since. They were in my pocket the day I signed my first 7-figure contract. They were in my pocket the day I made the final payment on the loan that had kept me up at night for years. If I press them to my face, even now, they still smell like her. I do that more often than I'd ever admit out loud. I built everything I have with my own 2 hands because the woman who raised me showed me, with her own hands, exactly how it was done. That is the one thing the Ashfords never understood about me, sitting in their gleaming club beneath their name carved into the library wall. They believed a person's worth was stamped onto them at birth. My grandmother taught me it comes off your hands. I met Ethan Ashford in a parking lot at 6 in the morning, in 8 inches of fresh snow. He taught history at the high school my company plowed every winter, and he had come out early, on his own time, unpaid, to help shovel the walkways before the buses arrived. I found him doing it completely wrong, hurting his own back with every scoop, and I walked over and showed him how to throw snow so it doesn't come flying back down on top of you. We ended up talking for 20 minutes while my crew finished the lot. He never once asked me what I did for a living. He asked me what I liked to read. When I told him, his whole face lit up, and he named a book I loved, and the 2 of us stood right there in the freezing cold, arguing passionately about the ending until his fingers went white from the chill. He was gentle in a way I wasn't used to. His coat had been mended carefully at the elbow, and he didn't seem to care that it showed. He looked at me like I was a person worth being curious about, not a set of numbers he was quietly trying to add up in his head. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the old instinct to shrink. I didn't feel the armor click into place. I gave him my number, something I almost never did, and told myself it was because he was a history teacher with kind eyes. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. He had spent 20 minutes with me and never once asked the one question that always, eventually, ruined everything. He never asked what I was worth. 2 years later, I would finally understand why. In his world, that question was only ever asked about people they had already quietly decided to reject. I knew the name Ashford long before I ever knew Ethan. Everyone in that county did. It was carved above the entrance to the town library, and it hung beneath the oldest oil portraits in the Historical Society, stern men in high collars who had once owned the mill, long before the mill closed its doors for good. The Ashfords were what people in that town meant when they said old family. Not visibly rich, not in any way you could point to, but placed. Seated. The kind of surname that got you a table without a reservation and a nod of respect from people who did not nod easily. Ethan wore that name like a coat that never quite fit him right. He had walked away from the family orbit on purpose, taken a teaching job his own mother considered beneath him, and built a small, honest, entirely self-made life. When he was with me, something in him seemed to loosen, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd been carrying since childhood. "It's part of why I love you," he told me once, early on. "You have no idea who my family is. And you wouldn't care if you did." I laughed and told him he was right. I didn't care about the portraits or the library wall. But even then, some quiet part of me noticed the careful way he said my family, the way you might describe a storm system gathering somewhere off the coast, closing in slowly. I asked him once what it had been like, growing up inside that name. He went quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I filed away and didn't understand for a very long time. "There is nothing more expensive," he told me softly, "than a family that has run out of everything except its name." I thought it was just a poetic thing to say. I had no idea it was a warning. I had no idea I was about to walk directly into the center of it. The first dinner was held at the family lake house, a grand old shingled place that had clearly been magnificent once, and was now visibly tired in ways I noticed and politely pretended not to. Margaret Ashford greeted me at the door in pearls, wearing a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She held my hand a beat too long, studied my clean but unremarkable coat, and asked warmly who I did the gardening for. "I work in landscaping," I told her. "Oh," she said, "you mean you work in landscaping," as though correcting a child's grammar, and that smile never once wavered. At dinner, Ethan's sister Vivian leaned toward me with the practiced interest of a woman conducting a survey. "And what does your family do?" she asked. "Are they local?" I told her my grandmother had raised me and that she had passed away. "Oh," Vivian said, and let the silence finish the sentence for her. "They were kind the way a locked, polished door is kind." Every question they asked had a floor hidden beneath it, and the floor was always the same one. "Where do you come from, and is it anywhere that matters?" I sat there, the sole owner of a company that plowed half that county under my own name, and I said, "None of it." I let them believe the dented truck parked outside was the whole of what I had. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, quietly proud of how gracefully I was taking it. I told myself I was simply being humble. The truth was older and far uglier than that. I was doing the same thing I had always done. I was making myself small so they would never have a reason to send me away. I was auditioning for a part, and I didn't yet realize the part had already been cast, and it wasn't the one I thought. Here is the thing you need to understand, because otherwise none of what I allowed to happen will make any sense at all. I never wanted the Ashfords' money. There was no money to want, though I had no way of knowing that yet. What I wanted, the thing I was truly starving for, was the table itself. I wanted to belong to something that had existed long before I arrived and would keep standing long after I was gone. I grew up with one grandmother and a rented duplex, no cousins showing up for holidays, no loud extended family arguing over football and leftover casseroles. I had built a company because I was good, better than good, at constructing something enormous out of nothing at all. But you cannot build a family out of nothing. A family is something you have to be let into. So when Ethan drove me back to that same snowy parking lot on our anniversary and dropped to one knee with a plain gold ring he'd saved 3 full months of a teacher's modest salary to buy, I wasn't thinking about his mother at all. I was thinking about a place to finally belong. I said yes before he even finished the question. I said yes to him, and in my own heart, I believed I was also saying yes to them, to the portraits, to the library wall, to a lifetime of Sunday dinners stretching out ahead of me. That was the old wound speaking, though I couldn't hear it at the time. A woman who has spent her whole life standing outside a closed door will do almost anything to finally be waved through it, shrink herself, hide herself, sit quietly while people who owe her nothing sip cocktails and privately decide whether she deserves a chair. I said yes, and I drove home that night happier than I had felt in years. I had no idea I had just handed them the exact weapon they would eventually turn on me. Margaret asked to see the ring the way a jeweler examines a stone for a flaw. She turned my hand toward the window light, studied the modest gold band for a long moment, and finally said, "How practical," in a tone that made the word practical sound like the ugliest insult in the English language. Then she got straight to work. Within a single week, she had appointed herself the sole planner of a wedding I had never once asked her to plan. It would be held at the club, of course. The Ashfords had always married at the club. The guest list would be handled entirely by her because, she explained, there were certain people who simply had to be invited, people whose grandfathers had known Ethan's grandfather. When I mentioned that I would love to invite my crew, the men and women who had built my life beside me, one snowstorm at a time, she smiled thinly and said she would see about the space. Everything I wanted became a thing they would see about. Everything they wanted was already, quietly, permanently decided. I watched a wedding that was supposed to be mine slowly transform into a performance of a family I was merely permitted to attend, never allowed to shape. And I let it happen, because pushing back felt like handing them a reason to push me out. If you have ever sat at a table where your welcome came stapled to a list of conditions, you already know the particular sound of that silence, the one where you swallow the exact words you meant to say, over and over, until swallowing becomes a reflex. Stay with me here, because that silence is about to get very, very loud. I told myself again and again that if I was patient enough, if I behaved well enough, I would eventually earn my way inside. I had absolutely no idea that the door had never been designed to keep me out. It had been built to open only when they chose the moment, and to make certain every single person they cared about was watching when it finally did. What followed were the tests. Nobody ever called them tests out loud, but that is precisely what they were: small, constant, deniable, engineered to leave no fingerprints. At the very next dinner, Margaret watched which fork I reached for and corrected me with nothing more than a glance, a full second before I even touched the wrong one. When I mentioned a movie I genuinely loved, Vivian said, "Oh, that's fun," in the exact tone you'd use praising a child's crayon drawing. Whenever I spoke, Margaret would wait a beat, then repeat what I had just said back to the table in slightly more polished English, as though she were quietly translating me for an audience that couldn't understand me on my own. I have negotiated contracts against men who tried to bury me alive in fine print, and I have never once felt as thoroughly managed as I did at that dinner table. Each small correction carried the exact same message underneath, patient and absolute: you are not one of us. You may visit. You may not stay. And the cruelty of it was that none of it was ever loud enough to name out loud. If I had said, "Your mother keeps insulting me," Ethan could have honestly, calmly replied, "She was only talking about forks." That was the entire design of it. Death by 1,000 forks. I started dreading the drive out to the lake house. I started rehearsing sentences in my truck beforehand, trying desperately to sound like a person they would never need to correct. I, a woman who had once told a county commissioner exactly where he could put his lowball offer without blinking, was sitting alone in my own truck practicing how to make myself smaller. I didn't even see it happening in real time. That's the terrible genius of it. It never feels like disappearing. It feels like manners. It feels, God help me, like love, like a small, reasonable toll you pay in exchange for being let inside. And every single dinner, without ever quite noticing, I paid a little more of myself across that white tablecloth. I finally said something to Ethan one night on the drive home. Not an accusation. Just a small, careful truth spoken into the dark of the truck cab. "Your mother doesn't like me," I said. He sighed the tired, weary sigh of a man who had been managing this particular weather system his entire life. "She's like that with everyone," he said. "Give her time. She'll warm up. Just don't give her anything to hold on to." I asked him exactly what that meant. "Don't give her anything to hold on to." "You know," he said. "Don't make waves. Let her run the wedding. It's just easier." I stared out at the dark trees sliding past the window and felt something I didn't yet have a name for. I had wanted him to say, "She's wrong about you, and I will make her stop." Instead, he was quietly asking me to be quieter still, to fold myself into an even smaller space, to hand his mother the wheel so the ride would stay smooth for everyone but me. And the truly terrible part is that I understood him completely. He had spent 36 years learning that the only way to survive Margaret Ashford was to give her no edges to grip onto. He wasn't betraying me. He was simply teaching me to do exactly what he had always done. But I did not want to merely survive her. I wanted him to plant his feet and stand in front of me. Instead, he kept quietly asking me to become smaller, and I kept quietly obliging, and I kept telling myself it was love. That night, lying awake in the dark, I finally let the thought finish itself all the way through. The man I was preparing to marry had never once, not in 2 full years, stood between me and his family. He loved me in every quiet way there was to love someone. He simply couldn't seem to do it out loud. And I was beginning, for the first time, to wonder what would happen on the day that quiet finally stopped being enough. Vivian invited me to coffee not long after. Just us girls, she said. A chance to get to know each other before the wedding. I should have known better the moment she said it. She arrived carrying a leather folder and a warm, generous smile, and spent the first 10 minutes being friendlier than she had ever once been with me. Then the questions began, and they were not the questions of a woman getting to know a future sister-in-law. Where exactly did I live? Did I own or rent? Ethan mentioned you have a truck. Is that for the business? Roughly how many people work for you? Is the work just seasonal? She was mapping me piece by piece, and I could watch the arithmetic running behind her eyes in real time. It was the same arithmetic I had spent my entire adult life carefully dodging, except hers was running backward from what I expected. She wasn't trying to discover how much I had. She was trying to confirm, for the record, exactly how little. She wanted it firmly established that I was a woman with a truck, a seasonal job, no family, and no money, a woman who could only possibly be marrying Ethan for one single reason. I gave her small, true, deliberately incomplete answers, and watched her settle comfortably into the exact story she had already come there to prove. Yes, I told her, just a truck. Just a small operation. I let her write the story she wanted written. I couldn't fully explain, even to myself, why I did it. Part of it was the old armor, the automatic reflex to appear smaller than I was. But part of it was something colder and newer, the unmistakable sense that I was being investigated, and that whatever they were quietly building, I did not yet want them to see what I actually was. I drove home that day certain of exactly one thing, that coffee had never been a welcome. It had been discovery. And discovery is always the thing you do right before a trial begins. I heard the word for the very first time through a door I was never meant to be standing behind. It was another one of those dinners, and I had wandered down an unfamiliar hallway looking for a bathroom, when I heard Margaret's voice drifting from the study low, certain, utterly unlike the voice she used in front of guests. "We need to protect the family," she was saying. Vivian answered with something I couldn't quite catch. Then Margaret again, clear as a struck bell. "She's clearly after what's left. A gold digger, plain as that. Some women see a name, and they smell an opportunity." I stood frozen in that dark hallway, one hand pressed flat against the wall, and I did not move a muscle. Gold digger. The word dropped into my chest like a stone swallowed whole. I had spent my entire life terrified of being wanted only for my money, and here, finally, was a woman convicting me of being a thief for money I had never once touched and never once needed. But it wasn't that word that kept me rooted to that spot in the dark. It was three quieter words buried right behind it. After what's left. What's left? You do not say what's left about a full, untouched account. You say it about something draining away. You say it about the bottom of something. I turned that strange, revealing little phrase over and over in my mind, and for the very first time since I had met the Ashfords, I felt the entire foundation of the story I'd been told about them begin to shift beneath my feet. They had a name carved into a library wall, and portraits hanging in the historical society, and a lake house slowly going tired and threadbare at every seam. And somewhere behind that closed study door, the matriarch of the entire family was standing guard, with real fear in her voice, over whatever was left. I walked back to the table. I smiled the whole way. And I began, very quietly, to pay attention. I did not get angry. Anger is loud, and loud was exactly what they wanted from me. Instead, the very next morning, I did the one thing any business owner with a functioning brain does the moment she overhears the word thief attached to her name by the family she's about to marry into. I called my attorney, not to attack anyone, but to protect everything I had spent 12 years building. I told her I was getting married, and I told her exactly what I had heard, and she said the kind of thing lawyers say that sounds cold right up until the moment you desperately need it. Fiona, she told me, you own an 8-figure company, and you currently have zero legal protection. We are fixing that before the wedding, not after. So we began. We drew a clean, hard line around my business assets. We drafted a prenuptial agreement of my own, one built to protect Slater grounds, my properties, my investments, every single thing I had built with my grandmother's gloves riding in the glove box, from anyone who might one day decide it all belonged to the family instead of to me. I had watched too many women hand over everything they had built simply to keep the peace, and I made the decision, right there in that office, that I would not become one of them. I signed nothing that day. I simply made certain that whatever the Ashfords were quietly planning, I would never walk into it with empty hands. I slid the folder into a drawer and tried hard to forget it existed. I told myself I was being careful, not suspicious. I had no idea yet just how badly I would need it. I had no idea they were about to hand me every reason in the world. I finally learned what what's left actually meant on a Saturday afternoon at the lake house, while hunting for a powder room and opening the wrong door by mistake. It was the study, Margaret's private room, and I stepped fully inside before I even realized where I had ended up. The first thing that caught my eye was the wall. There was a clean, bright rectangle cut into the middle of the otherwise faded paneling, the exact shape and size of a large painting that no longer hung there. I knew that shape instantly. It's the pale ghost a picture leaves behind after it has hung in one place for decades and then, suddenly, vanishes. There were more of them scattered around that room, pale wounds where things used to be. A cabinet stood open, half emptied. And on the desk, not hidden at all, just sitting out in the open the way things sit in a house where no guest is ever supposed to wander, was a short stack of mail. The top envelope carried a bank's logo and a red stamp across the front that I could read clearly from the doorway. Past due. Beneath it, the glossy corner of a sheet, the kind auction houses send out for estate appraisals. I stood perfectly still, one hand pressed into my coat pocket, and without ever deciding to, I closed my fingers tightly around my grandmother's gloves, the way I always do when the ground beneath me stops feeling steady. And the entire story turned over in my hands like a coin flipping in midair. They had never looked down on me because I had nothing. They had looked down on me because I had something real, something growing, something that was mine, while they, quietly and desperately, were running out. The portraits, the pearls, the name carved above the library door, all of it was a beautiful, carefully maintained front propped up over an empty house. Margaret was not protecting a fortune from a gold digger. She was hiding the absence of one. And she needed a thief standing in the room, badly, so that no one would ever think to look too closely at the empty vault behind her. I backed slowly out of that study, pulled the door shut behind me, and stood in the hallway holding those gloves. For the first time in 2 years, I was not afraid of the Ashfords anymore. After that door, every single insult I had swallowed changed flavor in my mouth. The corrected fork. The interrogation disguised as coffee. The venomous little, how practical about my ring. None of it had ever been about protecting a legacy. There was no legacy left to protect. It had always been about controlling the story inside that room, keeping every eye fixed on the poor, unsuitable woman Ethan had supposedly dragged home, so that no one would ever pause long enough to count the empty rectangles on the walls. And the strangest thing happened to me as that truth settled in. I stopped hating Margaret Ashford, and against my own will, I started to actually see her. Later that same visit, I passed the study again, and the door stood cracked open. She was inside, alone, believing herself unwatched. She had taken one of the empty frames down off the wall and was polishing it, polishing glass with nothing behind it, her hands moving in small, careful, obsessive circles. And her hands were shaking. She had no idea I could see her. She would have died before she let anyone see her like that. Watching her, I understood, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, that 40 years earlier she had walked into this exact family from somewhere with far less, and they had measured her at the door too, just as coldly as they had measured me. She had spent 4 decades since then learning to become a wall so smooth that no one could ever again get a grip on her the way they once had. She was not the author of this particular cruelty. She was simply its longest-serving employee. She was terrified, genuinely, deeply terrified of the red stamps, of the empty frames, of a town that still nodded respectfully at her name and would stop the very day it learned the truth behind it. I felt something I had never planned to feel toward her. Not forgiveness. Just recognition. We were far more alike than either of us would ever have admitted out loud. The only real difference between us was this: she had a name, and no money left behind it. I had money and no name behind me at all. And one of us still, stubbornly, believed that made me the one who brought nothing to that table. You would think, knowing everything I now knew, that I would have simply walked away. That I would have looked at those empty frames, her shaking hands, the word gold digger still ringing in my ears, and walked straight out the door with my company and my dignity fully intact. I didn't. Because I still loved Ethan, truly loved him, the gentle man from that snowy parking lot who had argued with me about book endings until his fingers went numb with cold. And because, even knowing what I now knew, I still wanted the table. Even a table sitting inside a frightened, broke house, I still wanted a seat at it. That is the part of this story I am least proud of, and the part one I'm being most honest with you about. Knowing they had nothing did not cure me of wanting them. It simply changed the shape of what I was afraid of. I decided, deliberately, that I would not use what I had discovered. I would not walk into a dinner and announce that I had seen the past due notices, that I knew the vault stood empty, that the entire grand performance was being held together with pearls and raw nerve alone. That would have been nothing but cruelty answering cruelty, their own game played straight back at them, and it would have won me nothing I actually wanted in the end. I did not want to defeat Margaret. God help me, I still wanted her to like me. So I kept the secret. I kept my folder locked in its drawer. And I kept showing up smaller and smaller each time, hoping that if I was patient enough, good enough, quiet enough for long enough, the door would eventually swing open on its own. I still believed I could earn my way inside. I still believed welcome was something you could patiently deserve into existence. I had no idea that the door had never been closed to keep me out at all. It had been closed so they could choose the exact moment to open it and make absolutely certain that everyone who mattered was watching when they finally did. The ultimatum arrived dressed politely as a formality. Ethan told me about it 3 weeks before the wedding, staring down at his own shoes the entire time. "Mom thinks we should have a prenup," he said, "just to make everyone comfortable. She's already having Vivian's lawyer draw something up." I asked to see it, and when it finally arrived, I read it twice through, slowly, just to be absolutely certain I understood exactly what I was holding in my hands. It was not a prenuptial agreement in any fair sense of that word. It was a surrender document. In the event of a divorce, I would walk away with nothing. Worse than nothing, the document defined everything I had ever brought into the marriage as family property, to be held permanently in trust by the Ashfords. My business. My properties. Everything I had built with my own 2 hands, long before I had ever even heard the name Ashford spoken aloud. They wanted me to sign my entire life's work over to a family that was, at that very moment, hiding red-stamped envelopes inside a locked study. And the beautifully absurd, almost comic logic underneath it all was this: they still genuinely believed I was poor. They believed Slater Grounds was 1 truck and a seasonal side job. This entire crushing legal document had been constructed to protect a fortune that no longer existed from a fortune they didn't even know I had. They were reaching directly across the table to seize assets they didn't believe were real, from a woman they had already decided was only after theirs. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't been aimed squarely at the one thing in this entire world that was truly, unmistakably mine. I sat with that document for a long time before doing anything at all. I didn't call my lawyer right away. Not yet. I wanted to see exactly how far they would take this. And more than that, I needed to see whether the man I loved would walk that far with them, right alongside them, or whether he would finally stop. I slid their prenup into the very same drawer as mine, two folders lying side by side in the dark, and I waited for the Ashfords to show me, once and for all, exactly who they really were. I gave Ethan every chance to be the man I had spent 2 years hoping he was. I laid their document flat across our kitchen table, where he couldn't possibly pretend not to see it, and I asked him a single question. Do you know what this actually says? He read it. I watched his face closely, waiting for the anger to rise, for the flush of outrage, for the moment he would crumple the pages in his fist and say, "Absolutely not. You are not signing this." That moment never came. He read it, and he simply went quiet. And then he said the words that ended something between us that I am still not certain ever fully healed. "Just sign it," he said. "It's only paper. You and I both know we're never actually getting divorced, so none of this really matters. Sign it, make her comfortable, and then we can finally just be happy." I looked at the man I loved, across our own kitchen table, and understood exactly what he was really asking of me. He was asking me to sign my grandmother's gloves away, to hand over everything I had built, in writing, so that a woman who had called me a thief could feel, in her bones, that she had finally won. "It's only paper," he said, the way people say things when they have never once had to build anything real from nothing, and so they simply cannot imagine the particular grief of losing it. It was not only paper to me. It was every freezing morning shoveling snow before dawn. It was my grandmother's hands guiding mine. And the man who was supposed to plant himself firmly between me and the world had just quietly asked me to lie down instead. I kept my voice level. I kept my hands perfectly still. I told him I would think about it. And that night, lying awake beside him, I finally understood, completely and for good, the exact thing I had been running from my entire life. Nobody was ever going to simply hand me a place at their table. Not even him. I could not sleep that night. So, for once, I did the thing I never allowed myself to do. I looked, honestly and without flinching, straight at my own life. I saw a girl in a rented duplex, learning early that the way to keep people close was to need them quietly and never once threaten them. I saw a young woman hiding her first real earnings like something shameful. I saw myself, over and over, quietly paying for dinners while letting the flinch show on my face, dressing down on purpose, driving a dented truck by choice, handing every person I ever loved a smaller, dimmer version of myself so that none of them would ever feel threatened enough to leave. And I saw exactly where all of that careful shrinking had finally delivered me, to a kitchen table at 34 years old, being asked to sign away the one single thing I had never once made smaller, my own company. All to keep a family that had never, not for one single day, actually chosen me. The armor had never protected me. The armor was the wound itself. I had spent my entire life making myself small enough to be loved, and the smaller I made myself, the less of me there actually was left for anyone to love at all. So I made myself smaller still, endlessly feeding the very thing that was starving me to death. I had done it with friends. I had done it with the boyfriend who told me I made him feel small. And now I was doing it all over again with the Ashfords, sanding myself down, piece by piece, just to fit into a chair at a table inside a house that was already, quietly, empty. My grandmother did not raise me to be small. She raised me to build. She wore those cracked leather gloves like a crown, not a burden. And somewhere along the way, I had taken every single thing she gave me and buried it in a glove box, ashamed, as though worth were something you needed to apologize for. I lay there in the dark that entire night, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I stopped apologizing. In the morning, I called my attorney again, and this time it felt entirely different. The last time, I had been protecting myself purely out of fear. This time, I was doing something quieter and far harder to put into words. I asked her to prepare a full financial disclosure, everything laid bare. The real numbers. The full company valuation. Every property. Every investment account. All of it set out plainly on paper for anyone brave enough to actually read it. And I asked her to finalize my own prenuptial agreement, the one built to protect everything I had made, and to add one plain, unambiguous page of legal fact right at the front of it. She asked me gently what exactly I planned to do with it all. I told her the truth, that I honestly did not know yet. I only knew that I was finished being the poor woman in a story that other people kept writing for me. If there was going to be a document laid out on a table, it was not going to be theirs alone anymore. My lawyer walked me carefully through the law, calm and precise, and I wrote every word of it down. A prenuptial agreement pushed onto someone under pressure, without her own attorney present, without full and honest disclosure from both sides, is not worth the paper it's printed on. It can be thrown out entirely. It protects absolutely no one. A fair agreement, she told me, requires both parties to lay their real numbers out in the open, with time to think it over and independent counsel to advise them. Their document had done none of that. It was theater, bad theater, at that. I assembled my folder piece by piece, the disclosure, my own agreement, that single page of hard legal fact, and I set the whole thing by the front door. I didn't know yet if I would ever actually open it in front of them. I only knew, with total certainty, that I would not walk into that room again without it. Vivian let the truth slip the way people always do when they desperately want you to know something and can't quite admit to themselves that they want you to know it. We were simply confirming numbers for the rehearsal dinner, and she mentioned, almost carelessly, that it would be a full room, 60 guests, all the important ones. Everyone will be there, she said, smiling, to witness you finally joining the family. That smile had teeth in it. I went home and sat with that single sentence for a long time. Witness you joining the family. 60 people. All the important ones. And slowly, I understood exactly what that rehearsal dinner was actually going to be. It was never a dinner at all. It was a stage. They intended to hand me their document in front of 60 of the oldest, most respected names in the entire county at the precise moment when refusing it would make me look like nothing more than an ungrateful gold digger throwing a tantrum. They had chosen their audience with surgical precision. A woman alone at her own kitchen table can say no without consequence. A woman surrounded by 60 watching faces, dressed in white, one single day before her wedding, with the man she loves looking at her with hope in his eyes. That woman is supposed to be far too ashamed to ever refuse. Public exposure was their weapon of choice. Shame was the pen they intended to force into my hand. And sitting there that night, I realized something that genuinely surprised me. Public could cut both ways. If they wanted 60 witnesses in that room, then 60 witnesses was exactly what they were going to get. Just not to the story they had so carefully written. I want to be completely clear about something, because it matters enormously to how this story ends. I never decided to humiliate them. I decided only that whatever happened inside that room, it was going to happen entirely in the light. And I was finally going to walk in there, for the very first time in my life, exactly my full size. The night before the rehearsal dinner, I sat alone at my kitchen table with only 2 things in front of me, my grandmother's gloves, and the folder waiting by the door. I did not rehearse a single word. For once in my life, I did not practice being anyone else. I simply sat in the quiet and asked myself what I truly wanted, underneath the wanting to belong, underneath 2 long years of steadily shrinking. And when the answer finally came, it was simple, and it cost me something even to admit it to an empty room. I wanted to be able to look at myself. That was all. Not to win. Not to destroy anyone. Not even any longer to be let in. I wanted to walk out of tomorrow able to look the woman who built 40 trucks out of one square in the eye, the woman my grandmother had raised me to become. Everything I had done for 2 straight years had been a slow, quiet trade of that woman for a chair at someone else's table. And I was finished trading. I picked up the gloves and pressed them to my face, breathing in leather and memory all at once, and I made myself a promise in her voice. Whatever happens tomorrow, I will not walk into that room as anything smaller than I actually am. I still did not know, that night, whether I would marry Ethan. That is the honest truth of it. I loved him, and I simply did not know. I did not know if a man who could ask me to sign my own life away just to soothe his mother's comfort could ever learn to stand in front of me, instead of beside me, while I bled. But I knew one single thing with total, unshakable clarity, sitting there in the dark with those gloves pressed against my cheek. I was finished auditioning. That part had never been mine to earn in the first place. And I was, finally, after 34 long years, going to stop trying. The club looked beautiful, in the way a carefully dressed stage set is beautiful if you know exactly where to look. I looked. The flowers on every table were silk, not fresh, dressed up cleverly under soft lighting so most guests would never notice. The staff on hand were barely half of what a room that size actually required. The chandeliers had been dimmed to a flattering, forgiving gold that also conveniently softened the worn patches in the carpet and the water stain creeping across the ceiling. 60 of the oldest names in the county sat around the room in their finest jewelry, and every single one of them believed, without a shred of doubt, that they were dining inside old Money's house. I knew better now. I knew the entire room was being held up by nothing more than nerve, silk flowers, and a name carved into a library wall. Margaret worked that room like the crowning performance of her entire life, radiant, gracious, touching elbows, calling half the guests darling. Vivian orbited her the whole evening like a moon that had never learned to shine on its own. And at the far end of the head table sat Gerald Ashford, Ethan's father, a quiet man I had barely heard speak a dozen words in 2 full years. He was watching me, not with the same polite, cold arithmetic everyone else in that room was running behind their eyes, but the way you watch whether you're genuinely unsure about. When our eyes met across that table, he did not look away. And something crossed his face that looked almost like an apology, one he had never once found the courage to say out loud. I took my seat. I settled my small clutch in my lap, and folded flat inside my coat was my folder. Their document was already waiting on the table, tucked discreetly beneath Margaret's place setting, exactly where she assumed I couldn't see it, patiently waiting for its moment. My grandmother's gloves sat in my coat pocket. 60 glasses rose together in a toast, and I understood, with total certainty, that the dinner had already truly begun, and that every single person in that room was about to get precisely what they had come for. Just not even remotely in the way they expected. It happened between the salad course and the toast. Margaret rose to her feet, tapped her glass gently with a spoon, and the entire room softened into the kind of attentive hush that only forms for a woman like her. She thanked everyone warmly for coming. She spoke a few gracious words about family, about legacy, about the sacred importance of protecting what generations before them had carefully built. And then, still smiling, still radiant, she reached beneath her place setting and drew out the document, sliding it slowly across the white tablecloth until it came to a stop directly in front of me. There is just one small family matter to attend to first, she said, and her voice carried effortlessly all the way to the back tables, trained by 40 years of practice to do exactly that. Fiona, dear, before you officially join this family, we simply need you to sign this. She let a pause open up in the room, and into that silence, timed perfectly so not one of the 60 guests could possibly miss it, she finally said the thing she had clearly been wanting to say to me for 2 solid years. Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family. The room did not gasp. It did something far worse. It went completely, breathlessly still. 60 of the county's oldest names sat frozen with their forks halfway lifted, every eye fixed on me, and I could physically feel the old, easy verdict forming behind their faces, the tired, familiar story of the woman with the truck and no family who had reached far above her station. Ethan had gone white in his seat beside me. Vivian watched with the small, hungry stillness of someone who had waited a long, long time for exactly this kind of show. And Margaret stood over me, gracious and merciless all at once, holding a pen out toward me like an offering. I looked down at the document lying on the tablecloth. Then I looked back up at her, and I did the one single thing she had never once prepared herself for. I smiled. And I picked up the pen. I did not sign it. I began, instead, to read it out loud. Calmly, clearly, into the pure silence of that room, I read their own document aloud to the 60 witnesses they had so thoughtfully assembled for this exact moment. In the event of dissolution of the marriage, I read, the party of the second part shall relinquish all claim to assets, and shall convey any and all property, business interests, and holdings brought into the marriage to the Ashford Family Trust. I paused and looked up and let the silence hang. That's me, I said. The party of the second part. Everything I bring, signed over to your family forever. Is that correct, Margaret? Her smile flickered, just barely, because this was nowhere close to her script. In her version of tonight, I was supposed to already be crying, or fleeing the room in shame, or scrawling my signature in humiliated silence. Instead, I was reading her own carefully sharpened weapon straight back at her, slowly, so that every single person in that room could hear, in plain language, exactly what the gracious Ashfords were demanding from the woman they had just publicly called nothing. I kept the pen resting in my hand. I let every guest in that room watch me hover it directly over the signature line, and I felt the entire room lean in as one, certain they were finally about to witness a gold digger sign away her own surrender. Ethan whispered my name, half plea, half warning. Margaret's chin lifted in something close to triumph. And down at the far end of the table, Gerald set his glass down very carefully, as though he alone had already seen something the rest of that room had completely missed. I let the moment stretch out until it became almost unbearable, the pen poised above the paper, the entire room holding its collective breath. It's a very generous document, I said quietly. It really does account for everything I'm bringing to this family. And then I set the pen down on the tablecloth beside their document, and I did not sign it. Into the confused, breathing silence that followed, I reached into my coat and drew out a plain manila folder, laying it flat on the table in front of me. There's just one thing it's missing, I said. I opened that folder the way you open a door you have kept deliberately locked for a very long time, without any rush at all, because there was no longer any reason left to hurry. I lifted out the first page and laid it face up on the tablecloth, exactly where the candlelight could reach it. It's missing, I said, the other party's disclosure. A fair agreement requires both people to show their real numbers. So let me show you mine. I began to read. Still calm. Still quiet. And the numbers filled that room like water slowly rising to fill a low place. Slater Grounds, I read. Commercial landscaping and snow removal. 40 vehicles. 90 employees. Contracts running across 3 counties. And then I read the full valuation of my company, and somewhere behind me I heard a single fork touch a plate and go completely still. I read the properties I owned outright. I read the investment accounts. I laid each page down as I went, face up, one after another, a plain, undeniable paper trail of an entire life built by hand. And with every single page, the quiet arithmetic running behind every face in that room reversed itself and then simply broke apart. These were not the numbers of a gold digger with a truck. These were the numbers of a woman who could have purchased the club, the lake house, and the very name carved into the library wall, and still had money left over for the salt on the walkways. You said I bring nothing to this family, I said, looking up directly at Margaret, whose face had by now gone the exact color of the tablecloth in front of her. Let's read together, then, exactly what nothing looks like. And at the end of that head table, Gerald Ashford, the one quiet man in that entire room who actually knew, better than anyone else present, precisely what the family accounts truly held, pressed both hands flat against the table and half rose out of his chair, staring at my pages, because he understood, before a single other person in that room did, exactly what those numbers meant. He understood that the woman his wife had just called nothing was, in fact, the only genuinely solvent person seated at that table. He understood, in that instant, exactly which family in this marriage had actually been marrying up. He caught himself halfway out of his chair, sat back down slowly, and never once took his eyes off me for the rest of the night. Here is precisely where they believed the story would end. They believed I would now slide my own document across the table in return, the way they had slid theirs at me, and crush them with it in front of all 60 witnesses. Take the empty house, the red-stamped envelopes, the shaking hands polishing empty glass, and hold every last bit of it up to the light for the whole county to see. It would have been easy. It might even have been fair. And it would have made me exactly what they had already decided I was, a woman who came to that table only to take. So I chose not to do it. I drew out the very last page from my folder, my own prenuptial agreement, the one built to protect everything I had ever created. I did not read it aloud to the room. I simply laid it down flat and said quietly, I brought a document too. Mine protects what I made from anyone who might one day decide it belongs to them instead. I was going to sign it and marry into this family anyway, because I wanted to belong here more than I wanted to be safe. And then I stood up. I stood up in front of 60 of the oldest, most respected names in that entire county, at my own rehearsal dinner, and I set the pen down for good. I'm not going to sign yours, I said to Margaret. And I'm not going to marry your family. I never was. Then I turned to Ethan, and I said the truest sentence I had ever spoken aloud in my life. I will marry you Tuesday morning at the courthouse, with nothing changing hands but a promise, and no name on it but ours. Or I will wish you a good life and go build mine. But I am finished earning a seat at a table that put a price tag on me. Choose right now, Ethan. Not for her. For you. The room fell into absolute, total silence. I had just given up the wedding I'd once dreamed of, the family I had spent 2 entire years shrinking myself to belong to, and quite possibly the man I loved, all in the space of a single breath while standing on my feet. And I want you to understand something important. Standing there, having just lost every bit of it I felt, for the very first time in my entire life, exactly my full size. Ethan rose slowly to his feet. For a long, suspended moment he looked at his mother, and then he looked at me, and I watched 36 years of carefully learned smoothness silently wrestle against something braver underneath it. And then he did something I had never once seen him do in 2 full years. He walked directly around the table, past his own mother's outstretched hand, and came to stand beside me, taking my hand firmly in front of every single guest in that room. Then he turned to Margaret and said, in a voice that shook but never once broke, "You just showed everyone exactly who values what in this family." Margaret, who had run that room like a stage her entire adult life, finally, visibly lost the performance. Her composure cracked open, and the truth spilled out of her in a hiss meant only for me, though it carried loudly enough for the front tables to catch every word. "You have no idea," she said, "what it costs to keep this family's name." And for one brief second, I genuinely did feel it, the 40 years, the empty frames, the shaking hands. A woman who had once been measured at a door exactly the way I had, and had never once stopped quietly bleeding from it. I did not hate her in that moment. But I did not sit back down either. Gerald caught my eye from the far end of the table and gave me the smallest possible nod, a quiet man's apology and blessing folded into a single, silent gesture. I picked up my folder and my grandmother's gloves, and I walked out of that beautiful, dimly lit, silk-flowered room with my hand held tightly in Ethan's. Finally, At long last, my full size. We were married on a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I wore a simple dress and my grandmother's gloves folded neatly in my pocket. Ethan wore his good coat, the one still mended carefully at the elbow. 2 members of my crew stood in as our witnesses, the very men who had built my life alongside me for over a decade, the ones Margaret would once have grudgingly seen about space for. There were no silk flowers that day and no 60 faces quietly running arithmetic behind polite smiles. There was only a courthouse clerk, a simple promise, and nothing at all changing hands. Except that Gerald came. He stood quietly at the back of that small, plain room, alone, watching me the exact way he had watched me across the head table the night before, and afterward he took my hand gently between both of his rough, weathered ones and held it there a long moment. We were the ones marrying up, he told me, so softly only I could hear it. I'm sorry it took me this long to finally say it out loud. Margaret did not come. I did not expect her to. And standing there in that small, plain, honestly lit courthouse room, I discovered that I did not need her to. The table I had spent 2 entire years desperately trying to earn my way into had turned out to be nothing more than a stage built inside an empty house, and I had finally, permanently walked off that stage and directly into a marriage that had my full size in it, with plenty of room left to spare. It was, without question, the smallest wedding in the entire history of the Ashford name. It was also, without a doubt, the very first honest one. The lake house sold that same autumn. The Ashford name stayed exactly where it had always been, carved into the stone above the library, but the town eventually learned, the way small towns always eventually do, exactly what had been quietly hiding behind it. I did not lift a single finger to save the Ashfords, and I did not lift a finger to sink them either. I let them keep their name, their debts, and their empty frames, and I stepped entirely out of that particular story because it had never truly been mine to write in the first place. Slater Grounds took on 2 additional counties that very same year. Ethan kept right on teaching history, and slowly, patiently, over time, he learned how to stand in front of me instead of quietly beside me while I bled. We bought a house together, using money I had earned entirely with my own 2 hands, and we put both of our names on the deed, separate and clear and completely honest, everything laid out in the open the exact way a fair agreement is always meant to be. He never once, not a single time, asked me to make myself smaller again. And I never once, in that house, had to pretend to be anything less than precisely what my grandmother had raised me to become. I hung my grandmother's gloves on the wall of my new office, framed carefully in the exact spot where the morning light touches first. Not hidden away in a glove box anymore. Not something shameful, not something small right out in the open, where anyone who ever comes to talk business can see them clearly for themselves. Cracked, softened by years of use, and worth more to me, honestly, than every single painting that ever hung inside the Ashford study. Sometimes, early in the morning, before my crews roll out into the cold, I stand there and look at those gloves, and I think about that empty rectangle carved into Margaret's wall, the ghost of the thing she quietly sold off just to keep a name alive. And then I think about the thing I chose to hang up in its place instead. She spent her entire life defending a wall with absolutely nothing left behind it. I spent mine ashamed of everything I had actually built with my own hands. In the end, only one of us ever learned to place her worth exactly where the light could finally reach it. Here is the only lesson I ultimately took away from all of it, and I will give it to you plainly, the same way my grandmother once gave it to me. Worth is not something you inherit at a table someone else has already set for you. It is something you build, patiently, with your own 2 hands. And no one, no matter whose name is carved into stone above a library door, ever gets to slide that worth back across a tablecloth and call it nothing. That is my story. A folder I almost never opened. A pen I picked up and then quietly set back down. and a name I finally, after 34 years, stopped trying so desperately to earn. If anyone has ever made you feel like you brought nothing to the table, go count, right now, everything you have built with your own two hands. And say the number out loud. Do it today. And if this story reached something inside you, pass it along to a woman out there who needs to hear it too.